with a research group at École Normale Supérieure at the intersection between experimental psychology and phenomenology. And we are working on disorientation. And we've been working quite a lot on the lived temporality during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is mostly what I'm going to talk about. So reports during the COVID-19 pandemic suggested that subjective time during the crisis could be described as passing both fast and slow. For instance, one of our study participants expressed that I felt that time during the pandemic passed in the same way it passes during a very long trip in a bus. While it lasts, it feels eternal, as if you were always in that bus. But once it's over, maybe even the minute you get down, it seems as if it never happened, as if an eternity was compressed in 1 second. It is well known that over time, episodic memories tend to be associated with faster passage of time in recollection. So we have quite a few studies in experimental psychology finding that. However, it is a bit unclear how opposing slow and fast judgments interact with one another. And this is particularly what we got during the COVID-19 pandemic. Really, these conflicting time feelings reports such as this one. So in this talk, I want to highlight our research group in Paris use quantitative phenomenology, or at least we claim to be using this method to investigate such relationships. So we started with a classical phenomenological analysis of the data that we collected. So we began by collecting a corpus of reports during pandemic lockdowns to perform a phenomenological analysis of subjective textual reports. We referred to Sandler and colleagues' methodology on applied phenomenology, and which is centered on openness, questioning pre-understanding, and adopting a reflexive attitude. In practice, we read the reports, we search for meanings, we organize themes, we discuss with one another the interesting phenomenological insights that we could gather in these reports. So we had around 150 participants expressing in their own terms the kind of experience of temporality that they had. We generated 5 themes out of these reports: temporal rift, temporal vertigo, impoverished time, tunnel vision, spatial and social scaffolding of time. Additionally, we identified an overarching theme, which we called suspended time, and which we claimed was a most accurate descriptor of the pandemic temporality, which connected to the other 5 and which helped us elucidate in the way in which the explored themes converged. But here, in this talk, I will only talk about one theme that we found in these reports and which we later analyzed quantitatively, which is temporal vertigo. So feelings of temporal vertigo could be described as faster and slower or shorter and longer feelings of time at once. They can appear uncanny, and these were widely reported by researchers from various research groups during the pandemic. Only the egocentric feeling of subjective temporal distances, as well as the egocentric feelings of passage of time, are distorted, rather than the belief about objective time and duration. So, for instance, one of our reports reads, "The pandemic itself seems to be going on for both 10 years and 2 weeks. It is difficult to conceptualize and uncanny." This experience is best described as a form of temporal vertigo because it is akin to the vertigo induced while reflecting on discontinuities and continuities of oneself while aging, for instance. Another report reads, "It's a rather curious period because it gives the impression of a long time that passes very quickly. It's quite difficult to explain. Government measures such as curfews and the closure of leisure facilities such as bars, cinemas, museums, etc. result in a slowing down of social life and make the time feel long. But on the other hand, I see the weeks going by at full speed." So 2 key elements to clarify the structure are temporal perspective and temporal scale. Temporal perspective has to do with where we are positioned with respect to the time that is the object of our description. And we can notice how the experience in this report is framed using the same perspective for the slow passage of time, passage of days, and the fast passage of months. I feel that individual days are dragging or feel longer than usual, but months are passing very quickly. Another report reads, the weeks are passing incredibly quickly. I cannot believe that a year has gone by since this all started. However, each day feels like it lasts forever, and I cannot wait for time so I can get into bed. So it seems that some participants make sense of the contradiction of both fast and slow or long and short time by appeal to temporal perspective, and some by appeal to temporal scale. So when you're relying on temporal perspective, you would say that it is slow in the present, but it is fast in retrospection. But we have also respondents who rely on temporal scale. That is, they are saying that days are passing very fast, well, days are passing very slow, but months have been passing very fast. So either you rely on scale, either you rely on perspective to actually express the contradiction that you are actually experiencing as a feeling of time. Accordingly, the flow of time on a day-to-day basis is slow, while the time that has passed, looking at longer time frames, seems to have passed quickly. So participants appeal either to perspective or scale because they only need one of the explanatory elements to communicate their experience. So that is nice. That is a sub-part of our phenomenological analysis. Now we want to take this phenomenological insight and turn it into something that we can use in experimental psychology. To research to what extent temporal vertigo may be associated with other affective disturbances of lived temporality, we validated a psychometric instrument based on the insight gathered during phenomenological analysis. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with scale development in psychology, but you have a number of methods that you can follow to create new questionnaire instruments. And this is a way we claim that we can do quantitative phenomenology, is to use insights from phenomenological analysis, like we just saw, and turn it into quantitative instruments. So for instance, in our quantitative instrument that we devised for our research during the pandemic, we had a number of questions related to passage of time and temporal distances, or the feeling of such. But these were questions which were framed a bit differently than what was already present in the literature. So for instance, for passage of time, you have one question that reads, at times since the pandemic began, time has been passing noticeably slowly. At times since the pandemic began, time has been passing noticeably quickly. And overall, since the pandemic began, time has been passing slowly or quickly. And for each of these questions, you have Likert scale possible answers. And the consensus in the literature would have you rather use a single question or a number of features, but not necessarily investigate how you can experience both slow and fast passage of time, or report experiencing this. So I will go a bit quickly over this, but in scale development, what you do is after you devise the scale, you validate it. So in order to validate a scale, you use factor analysis. And actually, you use a bunch of them. So first, we did a exploratory factor analysis on 20% of our sample in order to uncover the factor structure of the data that we had. And in the second and third step, we used confirmatory factor analysis to actually make an assumption about the model that you can make out of the data and verify that this actually fits the data. So you use exploratory factor analysis to fine-tune a model, a theoretical model that you have for the data, and you use confirmatory factor analysis to actually verify that it fits well with respect to the data. So for the quantitative study, we had 3,306 participants, so a very large number of participants, mostly higher education students that were confined during university courses, during lockdowns. We relied on the university communication directors to distribute our questionnaire at the time of our study. So we have quite a number of socio-demographical limitations with respect to our studies that we mostly focused on higher education students, but we also recruited a number of participants on social media in order to be able to check the effects of socio-demographic variables. So here again, I will go very quickly. This table is when you have a look at factor loadings for the various questions that you have in a questionnaire. Basically, in factor analysis, a number of questions need to go together when you do dimensionality reduction, and this is what indicates prima facie that you are on the right track to validate an instrument. And here, for instance, we can see that the passage of time questions, which are 48, 49, and 50, they all have good factor loadings with respect to the first dimension, which is the component passage of time PT above. So sorry, I will go very quickly on that, but basically this indicates that these questions, which probe passage of time in opposite directions, they fit together into a psychometric component that we can use for an analysis study from a pure experimental psychology perspective. So you also check a key metric, which is Cronbach's alpha, which indicates at which, the extent to which the components that you generate out of your scale are reliable. That is, whether they have some sort of internal consistency. And it turns out that we validated a number of components related to affective disturbances of lived temporality. So we had passage of time and temporal distances, of course, but we had quite a few other forms of temporal disorientation that we documented in the crisis. For instance, temporal order of events, or temporal self-disorientation, or temporal rupture, a number of these, which I won't go into much detail to be quite concise. Based on this instrument validation, we could now investigate how time distortions interacted with one another. Among all these interactions, we were interested by the role of temporal vertigo. So these reports that we saw at the beginning, which were about both fast and slow passage of time in your experience of recollection, and see how these are related to other affective disturbances and how these two are related to one another. We found that slow and long experiences of lived temporality during the COVID-19 period correlated positively with temporal disorientation, that is, with experiencing temporal rupture, feeling confused about the order of events, or one's self-location, or having difficulties in self-projecting the future. This is quite consensual now in the literature. Most researchers have been finding approximately the same thing about COVID-19. That is, it was a period of mostly slowed down temporality if we had to only keep one direction of the distortion. So if we look a bit more into how people responding to these opposite questions, we find that probing the various directions of distortions for the passage of time and temporal distances components appeared relevant because, as expected, there were nuances in the way people answered opposite questions. And we can see in this graph that for a number of these questions, this translates into bimodality. That is, you have, for instance, for question 48, which is at times since the pandemic began, time has been passing noticeably slowly. You have quite a number of people who agree and who disagree. So you have a mixed reported experiences. And when you take opposite questions, the percentage that you find and the way people answer questions are not exactly the same when you turn the question around. So this is one of this is a key evidence to actually claim that you can sort of experience both fast and slow passage of time, even though these may be instantiated with different perspectives or scales, but still your experience can be an overlap of this experience of fastness and slowness. And when we, now that what we can do is actually rely on the way people answer to these questions, to group them in different groups and conduct a number of statistical tests like ANOVA to see whether they have significantly different answers to the various components that we had in our instruments. And what you see displayed here are mean scores for components per time judgments groupings. And you see that, so what is displayed are effect sizes, that is the mean for groups per components. But for each scale, there are 4 different groups, whether in the blue group, you have only people answering that time has been passing slowly. In the gray group, you have people answering that time has been passing neither slowly, neither quickly. In the purple group, you have those that experience temporal vertigo because they report both slow and fast passage of time, or both long and short experience of time. And in red, you have the group of people, of participants who reported that time has been passing quickly or that time feels short. And the findings indicate that the detrimental effect of slow passage of time and the beneficial effect of fast passage of time counteract each other. As a result, the group with both slow and fast, or both long and short, are always in between unidirectional groups. So you can see that on the scales here, the blue group is always on the left, which indicates like the most disorienting experience, whereas the red group, the fast, is always on the right, indicating that the least amount of disorientation. And the purple group, the temporal vertigo group, is in the middle, but it's still a bit more on the right than people reporting neither slow nor fast passage of time. This means that you're better off during the pandemic actually experiencing both slowness and fastness, because you have fastness that counteracts the slowness of your experience, and this is correlated positively with the fact that you're a bit you experience less disorientation. Whereas if you only experience slow passage of time, it's the condition for which you're most disoriented. So this indicates that the positive association of passage of time are large enough for those participants experiencing both slow and fast passage of times to be better off than those participants experiencing no disturbances on their passage of time. To better understand temporal vertigo, we analyzed the responses of those participants reporting both instances of slow and fast passage of time. And this group represented 7% of our sample. Our hypothesis going into the study was that temporal vertigo was in itself disorienting and therefore associated with other disruptions in the temporal and social domains, but we were wrong, because actually, like we saw, the correct interpretation of our result is that you're better off actually experiencing some sort of temporal vertigo than only slow passage of time. What does this suggest overall? It suggests first that reporting an experience of fast passage of time seems to be positively correlated to well-being in times of crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, while slow passage of time seems to be an indicator of overall temporal disorientation. So there is still some sort of meaning to only probe for slow versus fast passage of time and not trying to decipher what part of it is slowness and what part of it is fastness, because you still have a good indication of the overall well-being of people in crisis with only an indication of whether overall their experience is fast or slow. And we also saw that temporal vertigo was not intrinsically associated with temporal disorientation during the pandemic. In fact, temporal vertigo may not be indicative of anything disorientation related about the content of a given past experience. And this is where it leads me to the main claim of the talk, actually, is that temporal vertigo, these experiences that we saw with these reports of both slowness and fastness in the content of, in the experience of recollection, it comes actually from mnemonic recollection itself rather than the content of the remembered episode. So in a separate study, we investigated temporal vertigo in the experience of service disruptions in public transports. These service disruptions are conducive to disorientation, for instance, when you're not feeling confident about arriving at work on time. We use social media bots on Twitter, actually, to distribute a questionnaire derived from the same COVID-19 psychometric instruments to people experiencing a metro disruption in real time in the Paris area in the summer of 2022. In addition to experience temporality, we generated components in factor analysis for the uneasiness associated with the disruption, as well as experience confusion. And what is really interesting in this study is that 20% of our sample are people filling the questionnaire in real time. So the experience and the temporality that they described is not mediated via memory, because it's really what they experience in real time as they are stuck in a service disruption in public transport. Here in figure 3, you have violin plots with means and confidence interval for each survey completion time compared to the disruption. On top, you have the blue group, which is the group for which the disruption is taking place now. So they are actually filling the questionnaire in real time. All the other groups are actually filling the questionnaire after the disruption is over. And so we can have a look and compare actually the responses that you get in real time with the responses that you get after the fact for quite the same disruption or the same crisis. And this is really what is interesting, because it's a bit hard to have such two forms judgments in the same sample. And respondents filling the questionnaire in real time reported slower passage of time and longer temporal distances to arrival at destination compared to other respondents. So this is quite congruent with the literature, in which you actually see that over time, people have a faster experience of time in their episodic memories compared to what you can find in real time. But for what interests us here, which is temporal vertigo, it turns out that people not only had a slower experience of time when they reported the disruption in the present, they also were not confused at all about which direction of the distortion their experience of time was. So basically, when they were answering in the present, they never reported that passage of time was sometimes passing quickly in the disruption. It was slow and only slow. So temporal vertigo significantly appeared over time with increased recollection delay. So it was around 2% of passage of time people when they answered the survey just after the disruption is over, like the second most top group in this chart. And it was 16.7% for people waiting more than 2 weeks before filling the survey. So actually, the more you wait and the more you will start actually reporting both slow and fast passage of time with respect to your recollection. So no significant differences appeared in terms of both confusion and uneasiness between respondents experiencing temporal vertigo and those for which that reported time distortions in single directions. So temporal vertigo, again, is not indicative of any sort of detrimental effect in itself. It is not in itself a factor of disorientation. So temporal vertigo is not associated with features of the disorienting event, as vertigo marginally appears when the episode is first experienced. This explains why temporal vertigo is not associated with confusion or uneasiness, which are about the experiences of the associated with the disruption. Because by being a feature of the memory encoding and retrieval processes, temporal vertigo is disjoint from the remembered episode itself. It appears then that not all sorts of temporal confusion are equal, even though they can be laid upon each other. Recalling one's past disorientation during can be intertwined with vertigo at the level of episodic memory. One's past temporal perspective can be confusing irrespective of the disorientation being introspected upon. So in conclusion, If we go back to these COVID-19 reports, again, this one, which read, I felt that time during the pandemic passed in the same way it passes during a very long trip in a bus. While it lasts, it feels eternal, as if you were always in that bus, but once it's over, maybe even the minute you get down, it seems as if it never happened, as if an eternity was compressed in 1 second. Temporal vertigo from this report, and now that we've seen it in experimental studies, it is readily apparent as a feature of mnemonic recollection to some participants. And theories of passage of time predict that fewer autobiographical memories make time feel as if it passed quicker in recollection, so it fits that picture. But this model in which you only model, you only plot passage of time in a spectrum in which it goes from slow to fast, and it can never be slow and fast at once, it doesn't fully capture the phenomenology of passage of time during crisis, in which both slowness and fastness may be felt as overlapped at once, even though they originate from different aspects of the experience. One is associated with recollection, one is about what you experience in the content of your experience. So you can still remember that you experienced it as slow, but in retrospection, you experience it as fast. But you know you have some sort of consciousness that it's only the mnemonic experience which is fast in the both slow and fast experience that you have at this moment. What we found then, beyond the state of the current literature, is that temporality during recollection is not fully described by a unique judgment on the fast to slow spectrum. It is still unclear what may be driving temporal vertigo in particular. Temporal vertigo, we found, is not intrinsically indicative of disorientation. And temporal vertigo appears with increased recollection delays, but we are a bit sure it's quite robust in our findings. And it seems that vertigo expresses that slow and fast feelings counteract one another in lived temporality during recollection, particularly in relationship with well-being. During the pandemic, those experiencing temporal vertigo were less disoriented compared to those for which time was experienced as slow and elongated, or compared to those with no distortions at all. It seems to be that temporal vertigo may be a coping mechanism which we should actually expect to appear in times of crisis, because in times of crisis, time is passing slowly, and if you cope well with the crisis, at some point, you should expect to actually recollect on that experience and feel some sort of contradiction. And if you don't experience that contradiction, that is that now time is passing quite quickly, and you don't have that many autobiographical memories left from this experience. If you don't have temporal vertigo, this may be a sign that you're still in the crisis and experiencing a very slow passage of time. From a method standpoint, quantitative phenomenology, from our perspective, involves the cross-fertilization of phenomenological and quantitative methods at various stages of the study process. This includes informing the design of quantitative instruments, so you can first do phenomenological analysis and then try to develop a number of new scales to analyze new things and new phenomena. But you can also use phenomenology to devise conditions. So if you want to compare a number of participants in your studies, you can also divide them as per conditions that you derived from phenomenological analysis. And you can finally also provide descriptions of subjective experiences that encompass a broad spectrum of phenomena rather than merely the mean or model experience. In context, for example, it is totally valid to say that during the COVID-19 pandemic, time was experienced as slowly, mostly. It is a mean experience. But if you look into more details, you actually see that you have other things as well. You have fastness at some points, especially when you try to recollect and cope with the pandemic. Consequently, quantitative phenomenology enhances the explanatory power of theories designed to account for the subjective experience of situations that lead to heterogeneous phenological profiles such as pandemics, wars, and human crises. And this is why we think that quantitative phenomenology is especially useful in interaction with cognitive science to document the way people experience a number of situations like crises and wars. Thank you so much for your attention.